Some years ago, I think maybe in the 1990s, a guy started turning up on talk radio programs who claimed to be a Catholic priest who performed exorcisms. I remember his favourite phrase seemed to be demonic manifestations of the undead. Years later, when the internet came along, I tried to research this guy a bit, and as far as I could tell, he wasn't any kind of official Catholic priest. He was some guy who considered himself a priest. Maybe he had a church, maybe he didn't, I don't know. But that sort of provided the inspiration for the following story. I've been wanting to write a story about demonic possession for a while now. However, I like to give my stories a bit of a scientific twist in the majority of cases. With that in mind, I found an interesting and unusual cause of psychosis cited in a number of studies in the medical literature. I'll put a link to one of those in the description. Do you believe in demons? Demons exist, my friend. Let me tell you my story. It was a bad year. My wife divorced me. My antique shop was doing badly because I could hardly face opening it, and I couldn't sleep at night due to pain in my stomach. I was taking all kinds of drugs to help with the stomach pain, but nothing seemed to fully fix it. In the shop I had an old clock that had been brought in by a middle-aged man who I hadn't seen since. I'd given him £50 for the clock, since its body appeared to be made of fine mahogany and was of an unusual design. Only after I'd purchased it did I notice that the hands glowed in the dark. They must have been painted with radium. Whenever the light grew dim in the afternoon, the glow of the hands would catch my eye, and it started to disturb me. For one thing, I was worried about the clock being a risk to my health because of radiation. I also kept thinking about the poor women in the radium watch factories, some of whom lost their jaws due to necrosis caused by radium poisoning. I wound the clock regularly, but it never seemed to keep the time properly. The hands seemed to jump to odd positions during the night. One Tuesday afternoon, I fell asleep in my chair behind the low counter. I hadn't seen one customer all day, and I was tired because stomach pain had kept me awake most of the night again. I awoke around 4 in the afternoon, breaking suddenly out of a nightmare involving a dark, ghoulish shape pursuing me through a forest, to find the clock sitting directly in front of me on the counter, facing me. I didn't like the thought that the glowing hands had been so close to my face for so long, but I didn't think too much of it apart from that. A customer must have come in, looked at the clock, and left it on the counter in frustration after finding me asleep. They'd probably return. All the same, I was so freaked out that I closed the shop and went for a walk around the old cobbled streets. My mind was in turmoil. The thing about divorce is, it chips away a part of who you think you are. I had once thought I was going to live a settled family life, with a house and children like my parents. But eventually I had discovered I was just some middle-aged loser with a failing business, and nothing else to show for the passage of time. I was walking along lost in thought when a guy on a motorbike almost ran into me as I crossed the road at a corner. Traffic doesn't move quickly or quietly in the old part of town because of the cobbles, but I hadn't seen or heard him coming. I was almost knocked off my feet. He shouted and gesticulated rudely. His face was wrapped in what looked like old rags inside the helmet. He sped off, leaving me shaken. I'm only telling you about these little, seemingly unimportant incidents because in retrospect, they were the start of the whole business. You see, these weird little occurrences began to form a pattern. I made up my mind to go and visit Linda on the other side of town. She ran a shop there a lot like mine, and also not hugely successful, but she got by. "Ray," she exclaimed when I walked in, "haven't seen you in weeks. I'm about to close up. Come and join me for a smoke." "You know I don't smoke," I said, laughing. "Well, a tea then," she said in a tone of mock frustration. "Whatever floats your boat." Linda was a true eccentric. She wore Congolese beads in her black hair and an enormous silver brooch, which she said was from Romania. In spite of her slightly unconventional appearance, she was a practicing Catholic, and the back room where we sat drinking tea was lined with many old and obscure books on Catholic doctrine and church history, as well as numerous painted icons covered in a layer of grime and various crosses and crucifixes. I told her about my nightmare, the clock, and the motorbike. "These things are sent to try us," she said. It was her favourite saying. "I'm honestly thinking of putting the clock in the bin," I said. "It disturbs me." "You can't do that," she exclaimed, outraged. "It'll have to be disposed of properly. It's radioactive, Ray." "Well, how would I dispose of it properly?" I said. "Absolutely no idea," she said. "Contact the council." "Anyway, someone might buy it. Whoever's moving it around while you're sleeping might buy it." As I was leaving, about an hour later, she caught my arm. "Ray," she said, "you're okay, aren't you?" "These days I don't know how to answer that question," I said. "Come again soon," she said. "You know where to find me." Over the next week I found myself staring at the glowing hands of the clock all too often. About 4 o'clock every day the light started to grow dim, and usually I'd put the lights on, but I began to leave them off so I could better see the subtle glow. Earlier in the day you couldn't really see the glow, although I began to convince myself that I could see it. My shop was lined with old objects made of dark woods and bronze. I had thought myself to be creating an atmosphere of mystery and ancient intrigue, but recently I'd begun to find it all just depressing. It was Tuesday again when an old man came in, wearing what I can only describe as a cloak. It was a kind of brownish waterproof thing to keep off the rain, and it was raining heavily outside at the time. His face looked Middle Eastern or perhaps North African. It was an unusual face, hard to place. I judged him to be around 80 years old. He walked around the shop occasionally saying, "Ah," as if he'd discovered something interesting, but then immediately moving on again, quietly laughing to himself. When he arrived at the clock, he said, "Yes," as if he'd finally found what he'd been looking for. "How old is it?" he said, abruptly. "I'm not sure," I replied. "I think the clock itself may be as much as 150 years old, but the hands have been painted with radium, and that must have happened in the 1920s. "Ah," he said. "Satan's minions live inside." "What?" I said. "Stained mildly on the side," he said. "Yes," I said, taken aback. "Some mild water damage." "Ah," he said again, giggling derangedly. He took the clock and brought it to the counter, placing it facing me. Then he said nothing, but looked at me expectantly. "Would you like to buy it?" I asked. In response, he only laughed again, and he walked right out of the shop, still laughing. That was enough for me. The clock had been freaking me out, and now it was attracting weirdos. I put it in a bag, and taking care that the glowing hands faced away from my body, threw it in the large bin I kept in the backyard. The council were due to empty it the next day. That night, the pain in my stomach came on again as soon as I tried to sleep. I swallowed some pills to subdue it, and eventually fell asleep. I fell into a series of terrible nightmares, in which I was lost in a graveyard and some vague demonic entity was pursuing me. I awoke suddenly around 3 in the morning to find the bed shaking. I gripped the sides in a panic. In my bedroom there was a kind of cheap but elaborate glass chandelier, put there by the previous owners. As I lay there terrified on my shaking bed, the chandelier detached itself from the ceiling and plummeted to the ground, missing my feet by only inches and smashing itself into 1,000 pieces on the floor. I jumped up with a yell and bolted downstairs into the back rooms behind the shop, switching on all the lights. My heart was pounding and I desperately wanted to talk to someone, but I wasn't really on speaking terms with my ex-wife at that point, and most of our mutual friends had somehow sided with her before and after the divorce, citing my allegedly erratic behaviour. I was brought face to face in that moment, really for the first time, with the fact that there was no one I could call. Certainly not at 3 in the morning, and not really at 8 or 9 either. Instead I opened my laptop computer and tried to watch light-hearted videos on YouTube, to bring my state of mind back to something approaching normal, but I jumped at every little sound, and even the slightest draft made the hairs on my neck stand up for fear it portended something sinister. When the sun began to appear, I turned to scanning the internet for news of earth tremors in the area, but I could find nothing. I remember that I had to take the large bin out to the front so that the council would empty it, and in my small rear garden I found a dead dog with half of its hair missing. I put on rubber gloves and threw the poor thing into the bin on top of the clock. I passed the rest of the day with my mind in a fugue. A handful of people came into the shop and browsed, but I sold only a few old coins. I was relieved that at least the old laughing foreigner did not return. When the night arrived, I approached my bedroom with trepidation. I steeled my nerves and told myself that the shaking bed and the fall of the chandelier must have been caused by some sort of tremor, either a minor earthquake or some road accident outside that had been cleared up by the morning. I brushed the shattered glass pieces into a dustpan and put them in a waste bin and settled down to sleep. This time I loaded a radio station onto the browser on my phone and set it running, just loud enough to hear, for the sake of the reassurance of a human voice while I fell asleep. Around 2 o'clock I half awoke to hear what I thought was the sound of the radio station. I groped sleepily for my phone to turn it off. Then I realised the noise I could hear could not have come from any radio station. A voice was repeating the phrase, "Darkness awaits you," over and over again, pausing in between repetitions to cackle crazily.
Darkness awaits you. Darkness awaits you. Darkness awaits you. Darkness awaits you.
When I realised that, my blood froze and I sat bolt upright, groping frantically for the light switch. I found it and switched it on, but the light, which was a small bedside lamp, exploded with a pop and a brief flash. I shouted, "Who's there?" and the voice instantly ceased. Steeling my nerves, I ran to the main light switch on the wall and switched it on. Then I ran through my whole house, switching on lights. Downstairs in my shop I found my chair had been knocked over, which reinforced my feeling that someone must have broken in, but everything else seemed normal. After that I couldn't sleep. I switched on a TV and sat staring nervously at it, wrapped in a blanket, until the sun came up. I went out and drank coffee and ate a croissant as soon as the cafes were open. Then I felt somewhat better, but still I had a terrible sense of doom hanging over me. I hadn't smoked for 10 years, but I seriously considered buying a packet and starting again. In the end I went home, fetched a bottle of wine from the fridge and drank a glass. Then, since I was still too spooked to stay inside, I decided to go and see Linda. I thought I heard someone call my name as I walked across the town,
Ray.
but when I wheeled around, there was no one there. I tried to pin down the feeling that was growing at the back of my mind. I realised eventually that I was feeling a sense of persecution. Life had ceased to be neutral towards me. The gradual loss of even long-standing friends amidst the decay of my marriage, and now these weird incidents. Life had declared itself my enemy. That was how I felt. Linda greeted me enthusiastically, bless her. When she saw the state I was in, she insisted on putting a "back soon" notice in the shop window and closing up temporarily. I told her about everything that had happened as we sat drinking tea from an old teapot in her back room, she puffing on some sort of nicotine-free herbal cigarette that smelt like oregano and mint. "Ray," she said, "I know you consider yourself a rationalist, but there's no rational explanation for this." "What are you suggesting?" I asked. "That you seek the help of a professional," she said. "What kind of professional?" I asked. "A priest." I scanned her face for signs that she was joking. "You're suggesting I need an exorcism," I said finally, after concluding that she was serious. "I think you have a problem with malign, disembodied forces," she said. "Demons, if you like. The proper person to help you with malign, disembodied forces is a priest. That's all I'm saying." "Where would I find such a priest?" I asked. I could recall meeting no more than 2 or 3 priests in my entire life, and all of them would have laughed me out of town if I'd asked for help with literal demons. Probably anyway, I imagined. "I'm going to give you an address," said Linda. "It's a church. The priest there is Father Gregory. Just talk to him." I would have gladly sat drinking tea with Linda all day, but eventually she announced that she had better reopen the shop. There was no way I was going back home at that point. The previous night had completely unsettled me. I had a choice between hanging out in cafes and bars all day, interspersed with walking around in the chilly autumn air, or visiting Linda's priest, so I chose the latter. Priests are supposed to be good with problems, aren't they? I thought that if nothing else, he'd be a sympathetic ear. I reached the church in under 10 minutes. As I walked up to it, I realised I'd passed it many times before without thinking about it. I tried the door. It was open. Inside, I found a priest pottering around. "Father," I said uncertainly, being unsure what one is supposed to call a priest. He was peering down at a leaflet of some sort. When I spoke, he looked up and fixed me with a rather intense, quizzical expression that I thought had a certain amount of humour in it, although it was hard to tell. "What can I do for you?" he said. "I'm having some problems and I'm told you might be able to help," I replied. "I wonder if we could talk for a few minutes." He looked me up and down. I knew that recently my appearance had undoubtedly become that of a man at the end of his tether, and perhaps that helped. There are some people who will look like they're absolutely fine until the very moment they top themselves, but I'm not one of them. Strange shows on my face very easily. "Of course," he said. "Tell me." I explained my problems to him, starting with the weirdness around the clock. When I'd finished, he said, "I don't understand what it is you want from me." "Well, I don't know," I said, caught off guard. Evidently this wasn't the type of thing the priest was used to dealing with. "Perhaps I thought you could do an exorcism." "We don't do exorcisms anymore," he said. "You'd need one of the happy clappies, but I wouldn't recommend it." "The who?" I asked. "The born-agains," he said. "Some of the evangelicals believe in exorcisms." "Oh," I said. "It sounds to me like you need a therapist," he said. I sighed. I had neither the money for a therapist nor any faith in therapists. Actually, I had about as much faith in therapists as I had in priests. But the difference is you don't have to pay a priest to talk to them. "Yes," I said, "I'm sorry to have troubled you." I began to walk away down the central aisle between the two sets of pews. When I had almost reached the door, he shouted, "Try St. Jude's." I turned, but he was already busying himself with the leaflets again. Outside, I looked up St. Jude's on my phone. It was a church on the edge of town, perhaps a 20-minute walk away. I decided to walk there. I was about halfway there when it began to rain. At first, the rain seemed to me further confirmation of nature's antagonism towards me, but in a strange sort of a way, it was also confirmation that I was on the right track. If the universe did not want me to go to St. Jude's, then St. Jude's was exactly where I should go. By the time I reached St. Jude's, a full thunderstorm was in progress and I was soaked. St. Jude's Church appeared disused. Several of the windows were boarded up, and the small graveyard that surrounded it was overgrown with weeds. A rusty old gate at the front was locked with a rusty chain. The church looked to have been built at least a century ago, and clearly it had seen better times. I was about to leave when I noticed there was a light glowing behind one of the few remaining stained glass windows. I didn't feel like walking all that way again, so I thought I'd better check the church out thoroughly while I was there. Accordingly, I hoisted myself over the low stone wall and walked up to the door. The door, surprisingly, was slightly open. I pushed inside, shouting, "Hello? Is anyone there?" The inside of the church was lit with multiple large candles. I walked in, bemused. Why would someone light candles in a church with a locked gate and boarded up windows? Suddenly a voice said, "Who are you?" I turned to see a man dressed in long black robes. He had a thick stubble and somewhat long, unwashed, lanky hair. An enormous cross hung from a massive chain around his neck. He was holding a large leather-bound book, which I assumed to be a Bible. "I was told you might be able to help me with my problem," I said. "What kind of a problem?" he said. "I think I need an exorcism," I said. "You've come to the right place," he replied. He marched towards me and extended his hand. "Father Withen," he said. "You may call me Samuel." Samuel listened intently to my problems. He explained that he was a kind of dissenting Catholic, not ordained by the church as such, but a priest nonetheless. "There has been an alarming increase in demonic activity in these parts recently," he said. "Many of my congregation have reported demonic manifestations of the undead." "You're saying this type of thing is common?" I asked. "Oh yes," he said. "The mainstream churches hush it up, of course. They don't want to be seen as superstitious. I have seen things that would make your hair curl. Demons manifesting as giant spiders, venomous reptiles, even beloved dead relatives. Yes, we are entering a time of profound evil, and the demonic realm is increasingly making itself known." "Then you can help me?" I asked. "We must determine from where the demonic manifestation emanates," he said. "The clock?" I asked. "No, not the clock. The clock is only a symptom, a focus of your fears. No, the undead always enter the realm of the living via a location, which always reveals itself. How can we find this location? Think carefully. Have you had any strange dreams?" "I dreamed of a graveyard," I said. "Something was chasing me in a graveyard." "That's it," he said. "We must locate this graveyard. Come with me." He led me into a side room where an old map was pinned to the wall. The map had numerous locations marked on it with small red crosses, and other locations were circled in blue. I don't know why I hadn't already walked out by that point, or why I had even sought this man out. He appeared somewhat unhinged, and I don't believe in this kind of nonsense, but a drowning man will clutch at straws. "Show me on the map where you live," he said. The map appeared somewhat out of date and lacking in detail, but I pointed to the approximate location of my antique shop. "Yes," he said thoughtfully, "we are seeing a great many manifestations in this area. There are 3 graveyards within a 2-mile radius. Here, here, and here." He jabbed at the map with his finger. I noticed his hands and fingernails were absolutely filthy. I wondered if he actually lived in the church. Facilities for washing in there must have been rather minimal. "How can we know which one is the right one?" I asked. "There's no question about it," he said. "This one is rife with demons." He pointed at a graveyard close to my house. "That is where we must carry out the ceremony." "Ceremony?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "It must be performed at night, on a moonless night. There is one coming up. We must confront the demons and force them to return to hell." "That's going to stop all this weird stuff happening?" I asked. "Oh yes," he said. "Almost certainly." I sighed. "All right then. Will we need to take anything?" "Candles," he said. "Crosses, holy water, and a goat." "A goat?" "Yes, we must sacrifice a goat." "I'm not sacrificing a goat. Are you out of—" "Please remember you are in a church," he said. He had a point. I had raised my voice somewhat. "Are you out of your mind?" I said, a little more softly. "We can do the ceremony without the goat, but there is a somewhat lower chance of it working." "But it still could work?" I asked. "It probably will work," he said. "Then let's do it without the goat," I said. We arranged to meet on the next moonless night, which was in 6 days. As I was leaving, I heard him mutter, "No one ever wants to sacrifice a goat these days." Over the following days, nothing especially weird happened, except that I kept hearing strange mutterings at night while I was trying to sleep. Linda suggested I give the voice a humdrum name to make it less frightening, so I called it Steve. I'd be trying to sleep and the voice would start muttering, usually in indistinct words that sounded like Latin, which I couldn't quite make out. I would say, "For God's sake, shut up, Steve." It didn't really help. I was still terrified, and I got very little sleep. In fact, insomnia was becoming a real problem. The day before I was due to meet Samuel, a car almost hit me when I stepped into the road to cross. I hadn't seen the car when I stepped out. It seemed these demonic forces were still attempting to hurt me. On the appointed night, I met Samuel at the gates of the cemetery. He was carrying 2 crosses and a sizable bag. "Take this," he said, passing me a huge silver cross. We headed into the cemetery. Ordinarily, graveyards don't really scare me, but I had become almost convinced in the reality of the demons or demon that persecuted me, and the thought of confronting them or it was not so pleasant. The absence of any moon meant the night was very dark. I hadn't thought to bring even so much as a penlight, and apparently neither had Samuel, so we could only just about make out the gravel paths in the darkness. Samuel marched steadily on as if heading for some unmentioned destination. "Where are we going?" I asked. "The centre," he replied. That particular graveyard was huge. I had visited it before during the day, because several of my relatives were buried there. It was big enough to get lost in. After 5 or so minutes, when my eyes had begun to adjust to the darkness, I thought I perceived a dim light coming from somewhere between the stone crosses and gravestones up ahead. As we got closer, I began to think I knew what that light was. A terrifying conviction seized me, and I was filled with a wave of cold dread. As we arrived at the source of the vague glow, I saw that my worst fear was true. The source of the light was the ominously glowing hands of the very clock that I had previously thrown out. The clock was propped against an ancient gravestone. "How is this possible?" I said. "Someone must have taken it from my bin and brought it here." "Demonic forces working on weak minds," said Samuel. "This is the place. Let us begin. I must warn you that demonic manifestations of the undead may appear during the ceremony. Do not lose your nerve." I nodded nervously. He proceeded to light 12 candles, placed in a rough circle around the clock. We stood inside the circle, facing the eerily glowing clock face. Samuel began to recite Latin verses, throwing small amounts of what I assumed to be holy water at the clock from a small bottle. It occurred to me to wonder if this had happened previously, and that was why the clock had water damage on its side, but that was a mad idea surely. I found myself staring nervously at the dark shadows beyond the circle of candles. The wind began to pick up slightly, and the candles began to flicker as Samuel's chanting seemed to build gradually towards a crescendo. He had been chanting for perhaps 10 minutes, when I thought I saw something moving in the darkness beyond the candlelight. Some oddly shaped form, almost insectoid. My eyes fixed on it. "Lux de tenebris lucebit," said Samuel. "Omne quod est demonicum, ad infernum redire debet." It was getting closer. I was almost certain I could make out horrible spindly legs. One by one the candles blew out in the wind. I could hear horrible scratching sounds, as though some monstrous crab or cockroach was dragging itself over the gravestones. Finally the last candle flame flickered and died. "In nomine Iesu precipio tibiut desinas." The thing was almost on us, a giant spiderous form, a vile, hellish arachnid. I wanted to run. I was enveloped by a hideous sense of looming evil. "We must flee," I whispered. "You cannot," said Samuel. Suddenly something hit me, and the dark world seemed to spin. My head fell next to the clock. The glowing hands seemed to bore into my eyes, and then darkness enveloped me. When I awoke, I was in a hospital bed. "Back in the land of the living," said a cheery voice. It was Linda. "How did I get here?" I asked. "They found you passed out in a graveyard," she said. "Looked like you'd been there all night. What on earth were you doing there, Ray?" "The priest," I said. "He was carrying out an exorcism." "Well, it looks like it worked," she said. "They tested your blood. You were massively deficient in several vitamins, especially B12. They say it's a miracle you were still alive." "What?" I said. "Why?" "Too much stomach medicine, most probably, they say," said Linda. "They found a packet of it in your pocket. You probably haven't had enough stomach acid to digest food properly. They asked me if you'd been experiencing any neurological symptoms. I told them you're loopy as a fruit bat." "Thanks," I said, struggling to a sitting position. I discovered there was an IV line running into my arm. "Vitamins and glucose," said Linda, nodding at it. "How did you even get here?" I asked. "They found my number in your phone," she said. "Oh, and they found a clock with you. I told them I'd keep it for you. They were anxious to get rid of it when I pointed out it's probably radioactive." My heart pounded at mention of the clock. "I don't want it," I said vehemently. "It's okay," said Linda. "I've already sold it. To a Middle Eastern gentleman, or perhaps Moroccan, I couldn't quite tell. Anyway, he gave me £100 for it." She slapped some notes down on the bed. "You've sold it?" "Yes," she said. "I did the right thing, didn't I?" "You definitely did. Thank you so much, Linda. But how long have I been here for?" "Just over a day, don't worry," she said. "You must have been very tired." Whether the exorcism worked or whether I was simply hallucinating due to not being able to absorb vitamins properly, I don't know, but I experienced no further problems of the supernatural variety. Neither did my stomach bother me again. When I was feeling well again, Linda and I walked up to St. Jude's, but it appeared completely boarded up and the door locked. The priest, Samuel, seemed to have gone elsewhere. We went to find Father Gregory and we found him going about his business as usual, preparing for a mass. I asked him why he had recommended Samuel to me. "Who?" he said. "Samuel at St. Jude's," I said. "Never heard of it," he said. It appeared he hadn't shouted anything at all to me as I was leaving his church. I must have been hallucinating. Samuel Withen was real, of that I'm sure. Who he was exactly, I don't know. As for everything else that happened, I'd rather chalk it up to hallucination and psychosis than supernatural demons. Demons exist, I'm sure of that, but of the supernatural variety, that I don't know. Thank you for listening. My name's John and you've been listening to Science Horror. All the stories on this channel are written by me, at least up to this point so far. Next week I have a story for you about a person who makes the terrible mistake of going on holiday with some people he doesn't know very well and ends up being poisoned by an obscure and terrifying poison. Do join me again for that. I try to get a new story out every Monday. If you like this story, please consider giving it a like and consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you so much. And until next time, sleep well.